Science has always told us that death is like turning off a light. The switch is flipped, and what remains is nothing but emptiness. But what if I told you that the latest data from electroencephalograms in terminal patients actually reveals something completely different? At the exact moment the heart stops, the brain does not shut down, it awakens. It enters a surge of activity so intense that it makes our everyday life feel like a deep dream. Why would the brain make its greatest effort precisely when it should have no energy left? 7 minutes. 420 seconds of brain hyperactivity that defy biology. What you're about to discover today is not a religious dogma, but a frontier of neuroscience that suggests that the end may actually be an expansion of consciousness beyond the physical body. Welcome to the Infinite Consciousness. Today, we're going to dive into what happens in those final 7 minutes and understand why science is beginning to suspect that you are far more than your biology allows you to believe. The truth about death may be the greatest comfort you have ever received. And the answer to this enigma lies in a territory that modern science is only beginning to map with astonishment. Imagine, for a moment, the architecture of a great city during a total blackout. The streets go empty and the windows go dark, but suddenly, in the heart of a building, the attic explodes into a luminosity so intense that it could be seen from space. That is exactly what neuroscientists observe while monitoring patients in their final moments. At the moment the heart stops pumping and oxygen ceases, the brain, instead of surrendering to eternal silence, fires a coordinated electrical surge. It is not a chaotic spasm or a short circuit of a system breaking down. It is a final symphony, an electrical awakening that forces us to question whether what we call the end is actually the moment when consciousness finally turns on all of its engines for an imminent departure. This phenomenon, technically known as a surge of gamma waves, takes us to the center of an unprecedented biological mystery, because these are the same waves associated with our highest cognitive functions, such as self-awareness and the integration of complex memories. What fascinates and unsettles researchers is the fact that this activity is sometimes even more organized and more vibrant than that of a person in a fully awake state. It is as if, upon realizing that the physical structure is collapsing, consciousness decides to pack its bags with absolute precision, organizing every fragment of existence at a speed that challenges our linear understanding of biology. We are not talking about a brain dying, but about a consciousness organizing itself for something that science still cannot name. This lightning in the dark is proof that life does not go out like a candle in the wind. It expands in one final and majestic discharge of energy, preparing the ground for an experience that goes far beyond the flesh. And it is precisely this millimetric organization of energy that leads us to understand that this surge is not merely an electrical event, but a deep manipulation of our subjective perception, creating a bridge to what comes next. Because if the brain is operating at its maximum frequency while the physical body falls silent, the inevitable question that arises in our mind is, what exactly is being processed at such speed in those moments? This peak of gamma waves works like a portal that alters our relationship with the external world, closing the doors of the physical senses in order to open the floodgates of memory and timeless perception. It is at this exact point of saturation of inner light that our notion of time begins to dissolve, ceasing to be a ticking clock on the wall and becoming a vast and deep ocean. And so, as we cross the threshold of this electrical awakening, we inevitably enter the second phase of this mystery, the phenomenon of time compression, where each of those 420 final seconds contains within itself an entire lifetime. And when we enter this state of brain hyperactivity, the first thing that collapses is our ordinary perception of time. In everyday life, we measure ours to commitments and the movement of clock hands. But science shows us that time is, in fact, a construction of the mind. In those final 7 minutes, that construction dissolves completely. Imagine that each second of life gains the depth of an ocean, allowing you to revisit memories with a clarity you never had while you were distracted by the concerns of the external world. This is not about watching a fast-forwarded film, but about immersing yourself in an experience where time no longer moves in a straight line. It is a feeling of absolute freedom, where the brain processes information in such a vast way that what appears to be just an instant to an external observer becomes an immense and meaningful journey for the one who is living it from within, transforming the end into a moment of pure expansion. This dilation happens because, without the stimuli of the eyes, ears, and touch, consciousness turns entirely toward its deepest personal archive, memory and pure feeling. It is at this stage that the past stops being something that has already happened and becomes a living and vibrant present. You do not simply remember a hug or a word spoken decades ago. You feel the texture of that moment as if it were happening now. This compression phenomenon allows an entire life of 80 or 90 years to be revisited and understood in its totality, within a time interval that medicine considers short. For biology, it is just a few final minutes of oxygen. For consciousness, it is the opportunity to observe the complete tapestry of your existence, seeing how each choice and each encounter connects within a perfect design. It is a state of clarity so crystalline that the fear of death is often replaced by a sense of acceptance and wonder in the face of one's own story. And it is precisely this immersion into eternity that prepares us for the final blow against the idea that we are merely flesh and bone. If we are capable of living an entire lifetime within 7 minutes, then physical time was never the master of our existence, but only a tool that we used while we were limited by the body. At the end of this journey, through memories, the brain reaches a point of equilibrium where there is no longer any distinction between the beginning and the end of the journey. The entire baggage of a lifetime is processed and pacified, leaving us in a state of conscious rest that defies any logic of suffering or agony. This deep immersion into time compression is what gives meaning to the peace that so many report in near-death experiences, serving as the definitive bridge for us to understand that if time can be bent in this way, then our true essence must belong to something that cannot be measured by clocks. And it is this silence filled with meaning that leads us to the next step, the final disconnection of the antenna. At this point in the journey, we need to face a possibility that completely changes our view of life. The idea that the brain is not the creator of consciousness, but an antenna that tunes into it. Throughout our entire path, this physical organ functioned as a strict filter, limiting our perceptions so that we could focus only on what was necessary for survival in the material world. However, when biological functions begin to cease and this filter weakens, the antenna finally stops resisting. It is the moment when the music does not stop playing, but the radio is no longer necessary to receive it. For the one who lives this experience, the sensation is not that the world is disappearing, but that the walls of a dark room are collapsing, revealing an infinite horizon that was always there, but that our physical senses were too limited to perceive. This final disconnection carries with it a freedom that biology never allowed. Imagine that you spent your entire life looking at the world through a narrow crack, and suddenly the door opens completely, without the weight of the body and without the need to process pain, hunger, or fatigue. Consciousness experiences a state of absolute purity. Many scientists who study this phenomenon believe that the electrical surge we saw earlier is, in fact, the final effort of the antenna to translate a reality that is far too vast for the brain to sustain. It is a smooth transition from a state of limited perception to an expanded consciousness, where you cease to be merely the passenger of a physical body and become part of something much greater. This process of disconnection is not a blackout, but a shift in frequency, where the individual self begins to realize that its true essence is independent of the matter that carried it this far. With the antenna now fully open and the survival filter deactivated, the human being reaches an understanding that words can hardly describe. It is as if all unanswered questions and all daily anxieties lose their meaning in the face of the magnitude of what is being revealed. This stage of the journey is marked by a feeling of unity, where the boundary between you and the rest of the universe ceases to exist in a definitive way. By freeing itself from the bonds of biology, consciousness does not get lost in emptiness. It finds itself in a state of total presence where the end of brain function marks only the beginning of a new form of existence. And it is this indescribable peace, generated by the freedom of the disconnected antenna, that serves as the foundation for the most impressive accounts humanity has ever known. The stories of those who touched this boundary and returned to tell what they found, and everything we have discussed so far, the electrical surge, time, compression, and the opening of the antenna converges to a point where theory meets practice through real accounts of those who have visited this threshold. One of the most fascinating cases in modern history happened in 1944 with the renowned psychiatrist Carl Jung. After suffering a heart attack, Jung found himself floating high above the earth, describing the vision of our planet with a precision that would only be confirmed by astronauts decades later. In his experience, he felt no fear or pain, but rather an absolute clarity and the sensation that he was about to enter a great hall where all his questions would be answered. For Jung, that was not a hallucination of a dying brain, but the most solid reality he had ever experienced. He described returning to physical life as a disappointment, because in that state of expansion, he had understood that human existence is only a fragment of something far more vast and luminous. This story of Jung is not an isolated case, but a pattern that repeats itself in thousands of testimonies collected by doctors and researchers around the world. What most impresses science is not the fact that people see lights or tunnels, but the profound transformation that occurs in the character of those who return. People who once lived under the weight of anxieties, vanities, and paralyzing fears return from those 7 minutes with a peace that cannot be bought or taught. They report that upon touching this final boundary, they realize that love and the search for knowledge are the only values that truly remain. It is as if, by glimpsing what exists beyond the biological antenna, the person receives an update in their own consciousness, beginning to see earthly life not as a burden, but as a temporary and valuable school. This change in perspective is the strongest evidence that what happens in the final moments is not a shutdown, but an awakening to a greater truth. If we look at these accounts and the data from neuroscience as two sides of the same coin, the comfort that emerges is immense. The fear of death, which usually accompanies us like a silent shadow, begins to dissipate when we understand that the end is a biological process designed to be a smooth and extraordinary transition. Nature, in its infinite wisdom, seems to have installed within us a transcendence mechanism that is only activated in the final instant, ensuring that no one crosses this bridge in despair. When we understand that the brain shines at its maximum intensity to offer us an entire lifetime of memories and a feeling of unity with the whole, death ceases to be an enemy to be fought. It becomes the final teacher, the one who removes the veil of illusion and returns us to the state of infinite consciousness from which we came, allowing the departure to happen with the dignity and serenity that every human being deserves. Therefore, as we conclude this exploration of the final 7 minutes, the invitation that remains is not to focus on the end, but on the quality of the light that we carry today. If consciousness expands and revisits every detail of our journey, then every act of kindness, every lesson, and every connection that we build now are the building blocks of our future eternity. Carl Jung, after his experience, lived the rest of his years with an unshakable calm, affirming that death was simply the blossoming of a flower that had spent its entire life in bud. May this truth about the functioning of your brain and the vastness of your consciousness serve as an embrace that silences your concerns. You are not merely a body trying to survive in a material world. You are an infinite consciousness, temporarily tuned into a human frequency. And your final glow will be the ultimate proof that life, in its purest essence, never truly ends. If this content has brought a new breath to the way you see life, do not keep this feeling to yourself. Share it with someone who also needs to hear these words. Subscribe to the Infinite Consciousness and turn on notifications. Our mission here is to explore these mysteries together, always seeking the light behind science. Your support is what allows us to continue diving into themes as deep and transformative as this. And now, I truly want to hear your voice. What did you feel when you discovered that your brain prepares itself with such care for its final moment? Have you ever had any experience, or do you know someone who felt this peace or this inexplicable clarity? Write it here in the comments. I make a point of reading every single one of them, because it is through your stories that our understanding of infinite consciousness becomes even more real. Thank you very much for walking with us this far. Remember, what seems to be the end is only consciousness changing frequency. See you in the next video.